Today I want to talk about depression, and we need to start by defining our terms. I think the easiest way to clarify this area is to talk not about depression per se, but the range of depressive affects, the range of depressive emotions, or we can think of a scale of different types or levels of depression. To do this, of course, I find it useful to refer to Melanie Klein's distinction between the two major positions, not stages, positions or two different organizations, almost like geological layers of the mind, a primitive paranoid schizoid position and a more mature depressive, or as I prefer to say, reparative position. Here we have the two different kinds of guilt. In PS, paranoid schizoid position, we have persecutory guilt or punitive guilt, but in the more mature depressive reparative position, we have reparative guilt, which really reflects what Winnicott called the capacity for concern for the other. Paranoid schizoid or persecutory guilt is all about me and how bad I am. Reparative guilt, my mind is off myself. It is on the other that I may have injured or for whom I am concerned. And reparative guilt is about how can I help the other? How can I repair the other? Punitive guilt, persecutory guilt, it's all about me. It's a form of narcissism, of course, how bad I am. Okay, when we think of depression, I think we put it on this scale from the primitive, PS, through various middling zones up to a very mature reparative position type of depression. I think ordinarily we probably would not call the kind of depressive affect we see in the mature reparative position, we probably would not call that depression. We would more likely call it sadness. I think even the most mature and evolved human being is sometimes going to be sad. The world is often a sad place. On the other hand, if you are only seeing the sadness, you probably are depressed. In the mature reparative position, we should be seeing both the sadness and the gladness. Everybody gets the blues. Even relatively mature depressive position people sometimes get a little down, and they may suffer from a bit of the blues for a while. They don't get stuck there, and they don't, even when they have the blues, they don't paint it all black. They're still able to a degree to see both sides. In a classic blues song, we sing, the sun's going to shine on my back door one day, which implies it's not shining there right now, but I've not lost my sense of hope. I have not lost my sense of the future. In other words, I have not regressed into the paranoid schizoid position. I'm still in D, depressive position. I'm able to see both sides. And so I'm confident that the sun going to shine on my back door one day. I'm confident that we will eventually get through the worst of this COVID-19 crisis. Vaccines appear to be on the way. Things will get better. So that's depressive affect in the reparative position. It is not totalizing. Ambivalence, the ability to see both good and bad, is retained. So sadness, blues, down, concerned, worried, regretful, but somehow hope is sustained. Okay, as we move down, as we regress towards the paranoid schizoid position, we're seeing more and more splitting. There is a loss of ambivalence, a loss of the ability to hold both sides. We're starting to paint it all black. And the more we go in that direction, the deeper into clinical depression we go. Okay. So the classic statement by Freud in this area, of course, is his famous 1917 paper, Mourning and Melancholia. He starts by noticing the similarity between mourners and melancholics or depressives. That sets us on a particular course that we need to actually correct, because by comparing depression with mourning, he sets us up to think that loss is central to depression because it's central to mourning. We mourn losses. Someone has died. A cherished hope has been dashed. Something has had to be given up because it just isn't there anymore. Okay, so this connection between depression and mourning, the connection between depression and loss. So for many years, psychoanalysts went a bit overboard, thinking of all depression as involving loss. But not all depression does involve loss. I'll come back to this in a few minutes, but let's just carry on with Freud's analysis. He sees the similarity between mourners and depressives, but very often mourners are successful in more or less completing the work of mourning. I'm going to leave aside Derrida's critique of Freud in this respect. Derrida, like most existential theorists, would say the mourning can never be complete because there's a sense in which loss is fundamental to the human condition. It's a wound that in health goes on bleeding, and that pathology comes from the failure to do this perpetual mourning that is the human condition. Okay, I'm setting that aside. I think there's validity to that analysis, but let's stick with Freud. The similarity between depressives and mourners, but some mourners get on with the work of mourning, and after a year or so, after someone close to them has died, they've completed this process of saying goodbye. For Freud, it's a process of reality testing. The object is really not there anymore, and this is very hard to accept, and it takes a year or so to gradually let go of it and to face reality. The object is no longer there. Okay, we learn how to get on with life despite the absence of this object. That's the mourning process, but in some people this breaks down. The work of mourning cannot be completed. They get stuck. It becomes like a broken record. They can't seem to get over the loss. They can't let it go. So what's the difference between those instances where we can let go and those where we get stuck, we get depressed, we can't complete the mourning process? Counterintuitively, Freud says it is not the loss of good objects that causes us to get stuck in this way. We think I had a good relationship with my mother, and it will be very hard to let her go. I didn't have a good relationship with my father, so it'll be easier to let him go, we think. Freud says no, it's the reverse. Good objects we can let go because they can be replaced by good memories. It's the bad objects that we have a hard time letting go. Freud is pointing to something like a hate bond. We hate them too much to let them go. And so because we can't give up hating them, and therefore can't let them go, we introject the hated lost object. We take it inside, and in that way we cling to it. But beyond introjecting it, we now identify with it. We become identified with the introjected lost object, and we carry on hating it inside us, but it is now it. It is now us, and we are now it. And so hating an object with which I have become identified looks like hating myself. And Freud says the depressed looks like he's attacking and hating himself. But if you look at his self-accusations and his self-attacks and his self-reproaches, they don't really fit him very well, but they do fit the object that he has not been able to let go of, but instead has taken inside and identified with. Okay, so here we have the formula for depression. It's based on an introjection of a bad object plus an identification with that internalized bad object. Depression is really hating someone else, but it becomes self-hate and self-attack because one has identified with the hated, lost, and now introjected bad object. Okay, that's pretty brilliant, and I think it's true, but only in some cases. I think the psychoanalytic world has vastly overgeneralized one type of depression and made it almost identical with all depression. I think this is an error. Sometimes the self-attack that we see in depression is not about somebody else. It's not about some object. It really is about me. At times, Freud seems to have recognized this. His whole theory of the superego. Superego is my id aggression turned away from objects and retroflected back against me. And so I'm not hating the object, I'm hating myself instead. Sometimes it's not hate that is turned back from an object. Sometimes I'm just hating myself. I am judging myself and finding myself guilty of various sins and crimes, and hating and punishing myself for those sins or crimes or faults or defects. So this is not about identification with a hated, bad, internalized object, necessarily. I mean, it could be complicated in those ways, but it is not essentially, it doesn't essentially have to be that. It can simply be that I have looked at my life, I have looked at myself, and I have judged myself guilty. And I am now reproaching myself and punishing myself. And a good deal of depression certainly is about that. Now here we have to make a very fundamental distinction. When I'm accusing myself of these faults and these defects, is this a valid judgment? Is this a reasonable judgment? I mean, am I really guilty of what I'm accusing myself of? Or have I been brainwashed by someone to accuse myself when in fact I'm innocent? Okay, let's look at racism. I'm a black person, and I'm accusing myself of being defective because I'm black. I'm judging myself as inadequate. Wrong. Inferior. Am I inferior? Am I inadequate? Or have I been brainwashed to believe this? There's a wonderful speech given by James Baldwin, I think in London, sometime in the early 1960s, in which he describes black people in the United States of being treated like animals and taught to believe that they are something like a mule, a not completely human thing, and therefore taught to despise themselves as subhuman, when of course they're not. So they're victims of propaganda. They're victims of brainwashing. They're attacking themselves. Their depressive self-attack is grounded not in anything real, but in a defectiveness that they have been taught to accept, an idea of defectiveness that they've been brainwashed into accepting. Okay, now these are two very different instances. Okay, my superego in both cases is telling me I'm guilty. The truth of the matter is sometimes I am. Sometimes the charge is not a false charge. Sometimes my self-reproach is completely justified because what I have done is wrong. Well, okay, well, what do we do in that instance? Well, we change. We have to change. We have to recognize our faults, our sins. We have to turn away from that kind of behavior. We have to acknowledge our faults. We have to apologize for what we've done that is wrong. We have to seek forgiveness by earning forgiveness, by turning away from our sins towards goodness. We have to undergo a conversion from unrighteousness towards righteousness. I don't mean self-righteousness. I mean we have to turn away from what is wrong and turn towards what is right. In other words, we have to reconcile with our conscience. I don't mean superego. I've lectured on that distinction, so I'm not going to go off on that tangent now. Conscience and superego being two quite different things. But in this instance, the cure for depression is reconciliation with conscience and changing one's life. Okay, but what about the other situation? I'm reproaching myself as bad and defective, but I'm not. Someone has brainwashed me into thinking that way about myself. What is the cure here? It certainly is not apology. It's rebellion against the propaganda and against the propagandists. It's rebellion against my superego. My superego is loaded with cultural crap. It's loaded with racism. Or to vary the metaphor, it's say I'm a gay person and my superego is loaded with heterosexism and I'm persecuting myself for being gay. What's the cure? I have to reject that heterosexist or sexist or racist or classist. Poor people, working class people, hating themselves for being working class, as if it's a crime. One of the best books on this is Richard Sennett's The Hidden Injuries of Class. Poor people defining themselves as inferior according to the bourgeois cultural standard internalized into the superego from the media, for example, and the school system. And they define themselves as inadequate, inferior, and very often in their later lives they will only let themselves achieve so much and no further. Despite their talents and abilities, they keep themselves down because they are victims of bourgeois propaganda, taken into their superegos. So in this kind of situation, there has to be a revolutionary attack on the superego. Freud himself recognized this. Not completely, but he called for the demolition of the hostile superego. He was in contradiction here because in his sociological work he thought of the superego as a good cop that saves us from falling into barbarism. But in his clinical work he saw pretty clearly that it's the superego that is the root of the problem. The demolition of the superego. I like to think of the patient and the analyst as forming something like a revolutionary cell. No wonder psychoanalysis has to be banned in totalitarian states. A properly functioning analyst with his patient forms a revolutionary cell, which is out to kill the king, to murder the dictator, to overthrow the tyrant being the superego. The racist, sexist, heterosexist, classist superego that is telling the patient that he's inferior and guilty when he isn't. But on the other hand, sometimes he is guilty. And that's a real problem of discernment that has to go on in every good analysis. I judge myself guilty. How much of it is true? How much of it is BS that I have been indoctrinated with? That's a tough task. Usually it's a mix. People who are depressed, who are self-attacking, self-reproaching, it's usually a mix of ideology that's been loaded into them by others. Freud himself wrote about borrowed guilt. It's that terrible phrase, as Paula Leon pointed out. Borrowed guilt, which is placed in a child by a narcissistic parent who won't take on the guilt himself, so he downloads it through projective identification. He downloads it into the child. Freud called that borrowed guilt. Well, the person who lent it is not looking to get it back. It's not borrowed guilt. It's imposed guilt. It's induced guilt, not borrowed. I mean, the term borrowed makes it sound as if the kid reaches up and asks to borrow some guilt. No, that's not the way it is. It is forced upon the child by the narcissistic parent who refuses to carry the guilt himself or herself. Okay, but some of the guilt we suffer from is induced in this way. But some of it is well-deserved. And unless we get to that, as well as the other, we're not going to have anything approximating an adequate cure. Okay. I've already mentioned that depression got associated with loss, and certainly early loss is painful. But we have to raise the question, why has the person not gotten over these losses? Why are they still suffering so much? Why have they not been able to mourn? Well, there's Freud's answer. The love for the lost object was a highly ambivalent love, and the unacknowledged element of the hatred has kept the person from being able to let go. That's one answer. We can imagine a lot of other answers. But I want to make the point that not all depressive self-reproach is about loss. It's not about the absence of something good. It's often about the presence of something bad. I may be depressed because I have certain bad inclinations, impulses, behaviors, addictions that I can't seem to be able to shake. Now, are they really bad, or have I been brainwashed into believing they're bad? Well, sometimes it's ideology and propaganda that has led me to think that normal, loving sexual intercourse with my willing wife is bad. I've grown up with some puritanical anti-sexual ideology, which is widespread in Christianity, certain forms of Christianity. It's a distortion, but nevertheless, it's widespread. So here's a person who feels guilty for having normal, loving sex because he's been brainwashed into believing it's bad when it isn't. Okay, so there we have to demolish the superego. But usually it's more complicated. Maybe something else is going on an unconscious level. Maybe the loving sexuality isn't so loving. Maybe there are, quotes, perverse elements of the sexual act that are not being acknowledged because they're going on unconsciously. And maybe the sense of guilt is not even coming from the sexual life at all. It's coming from some other area of a person's life where they are, in fact, sinning. And it's being displaced onto the area of sexuality when it really belongs somewhere else. Again, a thorough psychoanalytic exploration. What is really feeding this sense of sin? But my point is that it's often not about what is absent or lost, but what is annoyingly present. I seek to be a certain kind of person, and I fail in various respects to be able to achieve my ideals. Okay, are the ideals too high? Are they really my ideals? Are they ideals that were imposed on me? Well, it could be any of these, but let's assume for the moment that the ideals really are my own ideals, and I keep failing to achieve them. Well, why? Am I omnipotent? Are my ideals too high? Am I striving to be a saint? Have I failed to accept the fall of man? We were kicked out of Eden. There's a flaming sword at the east preventing re-entry. I have to live out there in the world where there isn't much perfection, especially among human beings. No perfection. We're flawed, we're broken. Some people are far more flawed than others. Some people are better in a moral sense. They're more honest, they're more loving. Some people are less honest. Some people are more hateful, hating than loving. Say my ideal is fairly realistic and reasonable, but I can't seem to reach it. What's the problem? Why am I falling short, even when I'm not a perfectionist? Why am I falling short? Well, this needs an investigation. Maybe I'm not trying hard enough. I mean, the trying to be a good person is a lifelong task. You pick it up when you wake up in the morning, and you work on it, and you should be making progress. You're never going to get to perfection. You're going to continue to have flaws, and your superego and your conscience both are going to point out your flaws. They do it in different ways. The superego lashes you. Your conscience calls you. I mean, your conscience is sort of sad that you're falling short. It kind of calls you back. Sometimes it calls you with a bite, the bite of conscience. It reminds you that you have to do better, that you have to try harder, but it's a loving conscience. It forgives you. It loves you despite your faults. It wants you to overcome your faults, but it loves you despite your faults. This is very different than the superego that is simply looking for an opportunity to lash you. Okay. So depression, not just about losses, but also about the presence of unwanted, the presence of the bad, not just the absence of the good. Okay, so we shouldn't assume that a depressed person necessarily suffers from traumatic early losses. He or she may, but he or she may not. The depression is not just rooted in the early oral phase. It can have its roots in the anal phase. It can have its roots in the phallic and in the Oedipal phases and in the latency phase, and it can have its roots even in later adult life. We've been too much thinking that it's rooted in early trauma and early loss. Okay. I've talked about the cure. The move towards gratitude. The move towards the depressive reparative position. In the paranoid schizoid position, envy is a real factor. Envy, destructive emotion. It's a humiliating emotion to be experiencing because it means that I feel myself so inadequate in comparison to these people that I envy. Mind you, there are the two kinds of envy we recognize now. Destructive envy leading to spoiling. I try to destroy in the other the capacities that I envy. That's very different from constructive envy, in which I seek to work hard to develop in myself the qualities that I envy, so I need not envy them anymore because I have attained them. Constructive envy leads to striving. Destructive envy leads to spoiling. But the real cure for envy is gratitude. To the extent that I am thankful that my cup is half full, I don't go around envying those whom I imagine have a full cup, because they don't, because no one has a full cup. That's a fantasy. But if I can be grateful for what I have, I'm free from this burden of chronic envy. And gratitude is an element of the cure of a good deal of depression. Instead of feeling like all is lost, I notice that not all is lost. I seem still to be here. I wake up and I feel grateful that I'm still on this side of the grass. Another day seems to have been given to me. My God, my heart is still beating. My blood is still circulating, and I'm not doing this. This seems to be given to me in some sense. Here I am. Here I am. Being. Here. Now. Thanks be to God. That's a good way to start the day. Okay.